Good evening.
Good
We
evening.
have 21. Right. We'll start the session. We started to talk about operational risk. And I discussed up to a certain level. Let me get the presentation. Right. I think this is the slide we stopped the other day. Methods used for identification and assessment of risk. So there are different methods. I think I have briefed you. Let me repeat it. Right. The first one is self-assessment. It's a very subjective method. Right. Different people in the organization. You get into a room to identify who you want to have in the room. You brainstorm, then you identify the risks, and then you do the assessment part. Next option is we can use a concept called key risk indicators. I'm going to discuss in detail later. Here what we do is we identify some indicators that hints you or that gives you an idea about risk. So for example, the labor turnover. If the labor turnover is increasing, that's an indication of risk because your operational risk can go up. Your staff will have to be replaced. Then the expertise might leave the organization. New people come in. So trainees will be there. New joinees will be there. So there is a possibility of errors, misunderstandings, and then misapplication of some actions. Those are possible. So likewise, you can identify different criteria as key risk indicators, and then you can define what would be the critical levels of those indicators. And based on that, you can identify the risk and assess. Then we have something called risk and control assessment workshops. Again, this workshops, what happens is you get people into a room. It's not just internal people brainstorming it. You can even invite external parties, experts, moderators. We can bring in and then have it as a workshop. You can have constructive debates in the room to get the real issues to the light. Then we discussed the loss data causal analysis, right? Causal analysis is where you go and identify the cause for the loss. Right? Historical losses you capture, and then you categorize those losses based on the causes. What has caused the loss to the organization? That will give you an idea where the risk is originating from. And that helps you to identify the root causes or the originating places of the risk and then address it. So next one is external loss data where available. That is, when we look at the risks, it is the whatever the historical data we use within an organization. We must understand the idea is not to replicate the historical data. Why we look at the historical data is to get some kind of a benchmark to predict the future risk. So when you do that, there could be situations where your organization's own history may not be a good benchmark to predict the future, because you may have had certain situations, certain controls, certain arrangements within the organization to curtail some of the risks. And when you look at the future, the variables or the feeders to the risk, what causes the risk, could be different to what you have experienced before. So in that context, some external loss data might be useful for you to benchmark, right, how the other organizations have got affected and what are the other ingredients in the external environment that will pose you the risk. But based on the historical cases, right? External historically, you can see some data based on what has happened to other organizations. With the audit reviews, I told you, so auditor, different depending on the type of auditor you deal with, because if you look at the external auditors or the financial statement auditors, they don't have a major role to look at the operational aspects of the organization. So their primary focus is to look at the risk in terms of implications to the financial statement. So they don't go beyond that. But the work can definitely support the risk management within the organization, because sometimes if you look at even the statutory audit, financial statement audit, the auditor identified, apart from the financial statement matters, they identify certain risk aspects. So certain ones they are supposed to report in their audit report as well, make a note of those things. Certain ones they do not mention in the audit report, but instead they will include them in what they call the management letter. That is from a statutory audit point of view. But there could be certain other audits that are purely focused on the operational aspects. And then those audits will help organizations to understand those things. So the idea here is an independent party coming and doing the review. That's the idea. Right. Now let's get into the ops risk framework, a very high level. Right. So ops risk management framework, as you can see, you have a cycle. Right? Cycle. It starts from one point and keeps on moving, and finally it comes back to the same point and again continues the cycle. Now, if you look at this framework, the starting point is risk identification, right? Risk identification is the starting point. Then we have the risk measurement and assessment, management and control, risk monitoring, risk reporting, then operational risk policy and appetite setting. Because you start with that, and with the learning you have gained throughout the process, then you feed that to the next cycle of the risk management by improving your policy framework. Then the next cycle, starting from risk identification, is based on the improved policy framework, which was updated based on the findings or outcomes of the previous cycle. So let us just have a look at each of these segments briefly. Risk identification. Now, earlier, if you can recall, I explained you some methods, right? Self-assessment, risk assessment workshops. So all these examples or the point methods I mentioned, you can use to identify risk, because it is very important to clearly park those risks into the appropriate category. That is supporting the next level, because once you identify, you support the measurement and do the next steps. So therefore, this step is important to clearly identify what are the risks that the organization is facing. Right. Then the next one is measurement and assessment. So once you identify the risk, you need to measure it. Now, I'm going to show you a diagram later. I told you the risk is a product of likelihood and impact. That you identify how much is the loss in case we materialize the risk, then how likely that it will occur, probability. So the probability into impact is the risk. So when you measure the risk, you use that guideline, right? You identify certain risk factors, and then you look at, in case this risk materializes, what would be the loss to the organization. Then you make an assessment, how likely that this risk will materialize, right? So then you can have different criteria to identify from which point you consider it as high risk. Right. I'll show you some illustrations later as we go. Then risk management and control. Now it is again important, because when we look at controls, there are different types of controls. Some controls are preventive controls, some controls are detective controls. Right? What's the difference between the two? So preventive control means you put a control to avoid something happening. Right? So that means if the control is effective, that will not happen. The risk will not get materialized. Then you have the other category, detective. So detective controls are those that highlights the management. If something has gone wrong, that means detective controls will only identify the risk once the risk materializes, right? So then it may be too late sometimes for the organization to act, right? Therefore, this one, the control part, is very important to identify what are the different types of controls we use, because it is not practical to have preventive controls all the time. Depends on the nature of the process, depends on the situation, you may have to deal with it. Sometimes you have to use detective controls as well. Then at least that will give you some kind of a alert even after materializing the risk. Sometimes even after materializing the risk, some organizations don't know that they are facing that risk. So therefore, it's good to have either case. Then risk monitoring. That is where you first, when you manage risk, you need to first identify as you could see in the previous diagram, you first set the appetite. What is appetite? Any idea? What is risk appetite? To discuss. What is risk appetite? Anyone?
The amount of risk, the how long, how much risk a company can sustain. Amount of risk.
How much risk the company can sustain?
Yeah, is willing to take in terms of risk an organization is willing to take.
Absolutely. So your terms have to be used very clearly. It is not can.
Okay.
Right? It is not about can. It is about your willingness. Right? Let's say, if I ask you how many apples can you eat, you can say I can eat even 5 apples. But you might decide, no, I'm going to eat only 3 now. Right? I can eat 5 if I want, but I'm comfortable. Right? My appetite is for 3 apples. So appetite is a choice that you make. Right? So you have to decide how much risk you are going to assume. So then once you decide on how much risk you are going to assume, you will then determine what are the controls and indicators to alert you about different risks and then act on those. So that's why this risk monitoring appetite is important, because appetite will tell you what you are willing to take, and then there has to be a mechanism in the organization to measure or quantify different risks and indicators, and then you compare against the appetite, right, and see whether you have reached the limits that you want to embrace or whether you are comfortable with it. Now, this tells you another aspect, because for you to have this kind of accurate information, for you to do the monitoring part, you need timely information, right? That means you need to have a strong management information function within the organization that disseminates information efficiently in a timely manner, right? Because some organizations don't believe in it. So most of the banks, I think large banks, they have separate risk management system, automated system. So because that is very important for organizations to capture data from different points and then assess them when you manage the risk. Right. The next one is risk reporting. Right. Now, risk reporting, I think we discussed the other day as well. Right. It can include escalations. It can include regular reporting as well. Now, you need to report clearly for the audience to know with the indicators of different risks. Then you can have, what do you mean by a near miss? There are 2 terms here, losses and near misses. What are losses? What are losses? Any idea? What is a loss? What is a loss? Actual P&L charge. Okay. So in terms of risk, what is a loss? Yes. In other words, we can consider realized risk, right? Realized or materialized risk without a mitigation, right? So risk can get materialized, but it may not necessarily lead to a loss. Say, for example, if you have taken a insurance, right? So you have a risk of your vehicles meeting with an accident. There's a risk. So you have taken an insurance policy. Now your vehicle met with an accident. There is a loss, financial loss, but the insurer will take care of that loss. Therefore, it will not become a loss to the organization. There's risk materialized, but no loss. However, if you have underinsured the vehicle, then of course you have to pay something when you claim the amount, then there is a loss in that. So likewise, whatever the amount that you have to bear will become the loss. So that is within realized risk, right? Risk is realized and then no mitigation. That's how you get the loss there. What is a near miss? You can see another word here, near miss. What is that? Any idea?
A potential loss that would have incurred had it not been detected previously.
Potential loss. Provision. Any further? Any further thoughts about near misses? No idea? Okay, let me give you an example. Think about a situation where you have your counter, banks, counter, cashier counters. Customers come to transact, they deposit money and they withdraw money. Assume a customer comes and the customer withdraws money 10,000. Right? Customer withdraws money 10,000. And the cashier staff, whoever is giving the money back, handling the counter, she takes some money from the drawer, manually count it, and then give it to the person. The person goes away. Now, instead of 10,000, this person has given 15,000, mistakenly given another 5,000. 3 5,000 notes were given instead of 2. So what is it? The person walks away with it. What is it? How do you categorize it? Mistake. Yeah, mistake. It's a human mistake or error, but where you end up, Is there a loss to the organization or not?
It will be a loss.
Huh?
It will fall under a loss.
Fall under
A loss.
loss. It is a loss. There's a loss of 5,000. Technically, there's a loss of 5,000. Then whether you recover it from the cashier or not is depending on your policy. You think whether it's a loss to the organization. See, sometimes if you have a policy, if there's a cash shortage, the cashier has to pocket out. Then there's no loss to the organization, but for the individual, it's a cost. Anyway, if you don't have that kind of a thing, it's a loss. Now, what if the person, whoever takes the money, right, and walks away, didn't realize that the money, extra money was given. And the cashier felt that something was wrong, right? Probably she has made a mistake or something. So ask the security guard, chase the person, and before the person gets into the vehicle or whatever, somehow catch the person and explain, get the extra 5,000 back to the organization. Okay. So if that was the scenario, is there anything to report? Or is there a loss to the organization?
It should be reported as a near miss.
So what is a near miss then? Now I have given you explanation. What is a near miss?
That was prevented because of a control. That was that was something that would have ended up as a loss, but was prevented.
Narrow escape, right? Almost lost, but managed to recover. Now, that kind of things, right? There can be instances where you will not end up incurring a loss. But you saw there was a scenario, it would have been a loss if not for some immediate actions. Those are not planned controls. Those are not preventive or detective controls that you have. If you have controls, prevent or detect, then it's part of the process. If you don't have controls like that, because when she realizes, they ask the security guard to chase the person and get it. Imagine the person has already left the place, then you have to have other steps. You have to call the person at home and see whether the person is accepting that the person has taken extra money, right? A lot of things. Anyway, if you get the money back, you can say that's no loss to the organization, but you can't close the matter, right? So there are enough cases in organization banks, you can see this kind of situation, right? It will not end up having a loss, but there could be incidents and instances where you have a narrow escape, you manage to get it back, you manage to mitigate the risk, manage to recover, there's no loss, but there was an incident. So those things we identify as near misses. You need to report it. Why? Although there is no loss in that instance, that gave you an alert, that gave you a hint that this could be possible, right? So what if the same thing happens again? Instead of 10,000, the person gives 15,000, extra money will go out. Then you need to look at why this happens. What was the problem? So one thing could be this person, when you manually count, sometimes there can be certain notes attached together. You don't realize it, especially when you work with fresh money, it happens, right? Sometimes you have 2 or 3 leaves attached together. You don't realize it. If you put the money to a money counting machine, most probably this problem will be solved, because you must have seen when you go to the counter, sometimes the counter people, even when you withdraw 1,000 rupees, the single note, they still put it to the machine and get it. You must have seen it. Probably they have that experience, because sometimes you can see two notes are attached together. So when you put it to the machine, it won't happen. it counts accurately. So the control could be whenever the money is dispensed, you use the cash counting machine. So you can introduce a control based on that nearness. Right? Otherwise, you introduce a control when you experience a loss. That's why the reporting, it's important to report both losses as well as near misses. Predefined danger limit should be defined by setting triggers and limits on the data, right? So we sometimes use this red, amber, green color code, right? Whenever there are deviations or escalations of certain matrices, we need to decide what level we consider as normal, what level we consider as severe, right? So then those red, amber, green color code will be based on the cutoff that you identify, right? In terms of value or whatever the case is, right? Then we have operation risk policy. So the last one, because you start with a policy, whatever the learnings during the cycle, you will again feed back to the policy. So your policy might get updated based on the experience you have had during the cycle. Now, although it seems very simple, easy to follow steps, don't forget that this is about the overall operational risk management policy of a bank or financial institution. So that involves a lot of people, departments, and information. So therefore, although it is easy, as you can see in the note, coordinating across all the departments and individuals connected to this is not easy in the organization. So that's why we need a strong governance, culture, and leadership to ensure that you drive this process, because if you don't get the support and cooperation of each segment in the organization, you can't complete this exercise. Right, let's move. Now then, you know, these are the 4 areas you find in the definition in the operational risk, right? People, processes, systems, or external events. So here you can see some examples. So I told you, when you identify risk, you need to identify the risk taking each component of the operational risk into consideration, right? So you have people related risk, process related, system related, external events. So that's an exercise you need to do, because then you know where the problem is, right? So here are some examples or definitions you can see under each category. Under people risk, you say inadequately defined roles and responsibilities. If your organization does not have proper JDs, job descriptions to your employees, that can create people risk, because they do not have a clear idea about the exact scope of their work. They may have a gross idea about what they expect to do, but they don't know their boundaries, right? Up to which point each person need to work, because the next person might not know the boundary of the previous person. Therefore, there could be a gap between what the first person finishes and the next person starts, right? And there can be duplication of efforts, and there can be certain tasks completely ignored or left out. No one is responsible for that. You can have that kind of issue. The lack of succession plan for key staff, that again is a risk. So we call this a key person risk. But if you identify the critical people in the organization at each level, and then see whether you have a backup arrangement or a successor for each of these persons, right? For see, okay, what if this person leaves the organization? What if this person is no more there, right? So then there has to be someone to take care of that. Then when you have people not competent for the job, that is understood. So there is a possibility of mistakes. Improper staff conduct, right? So some organizations have these people who don't care about the policies and procedures, right? They just do whatever they feel is right. They just do whatever they want to do. They don't worry about the policies and procedures. So that kind of people will also be found in organizations, right? They have improper conduct. They have no control over them. They have no respect to the culture there. So that will also have different types of implications, as you can understand how it will affect. Then the process, lack of written procedures. If you don't have a proper procedure manual that explains each and every process in the organization, including who's responsible for what, right? You have to have all of them, right? Then absence of defined process, manual intervention causes pinch points, right? In the processes, if you have more manual interventions, that again will have those issues. An escalation procedure, I told you earlier as well. If you don't have escalation procedures, there's no way you inform the issues to the next levels. Sometimes the top management get to know it very late. Then probably sometimes there could have been certain steps the top management would have taken, right? If they knew about the issues earlier. Then we have the system risk, system unavailable, that is due to traffic probably, right? Outage, the system can't handle the volume, right? That can be the issue. And then data, right? If the data integrity is not there, so data is not traceable, you have those issues. And this is a common thing, password being shared by staff, right? So I told you the other day as well, when you have certain branches, so probably everyone in the branch knows the passwords of others, everyone. Then that creates a problem. What is compromised there? When passwords are shared, what is the issue? What aspect is compromised?
Accountability.
Accountability, is it compromised? How do you deal with it? So if the passwords are shared, what happens? Security. Okay. So think in terms of controls. Now, what happens is there's no segregation there, right? You give different people different tasks. When you share the password, right? Even one person can do everyone's work because that person has the password of the others. Then the whole spirit of segregating work, whole spirit of assigning each task to each person, because the password, the idea is that you give the person a password and then let that person perform that task. So only that person has access to the particular app or whatever the systems, and then that person is expected to do the task. But if that person shares the password with another, you are allowing the other person to do both people's work, right? The spirit of having a password. So of course, it will also have information security issues if the person was handling some sensitive information and you share the password with the other, then you have information security issues as well. Now, remember, the interesting thing here is that, right, I told you at the exam, you have to be very, very careful and you have to be sure of your answers, and it has to be precise. Now, you can see there are 4 categories here. The examples are given under each category. So when you have the situation, password being shared by staff, most probably people think it's a people issue. It's a people risk. Password sharing is a people risk. But it is coming under system risk, right? That's how it is categorized. The denial of service attacks, right? That means you don't have enough security to defend. Then external events, terrorist actions, customer frauds, supplier issues, and then due to natural disasters or issues, you are unable to attend to your work. So these are just examples. We need to be able to identify similar cases according to respective points. Right. Then we come back to operational risk management and measurement again. I explained you about the likelihood and occurrence part. Now, one of the challenges we have when we measure or assess the risk is we need relevant objective data. What do you mean by relevant and objective data? Relevant means the data should have a bearing on the matter we're discussing, on the area we are touching. Right? So if it is not relevant, if it is not connected to what we look at, then it's not easy or it's not supporting our evaluation. Second, objective data. What do you mean by objective data? Right? What do you mean by objective data? Can anyone tell me? Objective data? Any idea? No idea? Objective data? What is objective? What is the opposite of objective? What is opposite of objective? Any idea? Opposite?
Subjective.
Subjective. That is subjective. So then what is objective? Not subjective. That means you need to have data that is verifiable and that is not biased. That is not individual choices or preferences. Right? So when we want to measure the risk, we need objective data. That means the data will justify or support your assessment, not your gut feeling. Right? So most of the organizations, this is the problem. They do not have adequate data to make a proper assessment about the risk. Then there is this question in the chat box. Someone is asking, what is a denial of service attack? What is a denial of service? Can anyone tell me, do we have IT people or risk people? What is a DOS attack? Anyone? Have you experienced this? In very simple terms, what happens there is that some people try to attack the system and that leads to shut down, right? Either shutting down the system or deny the access even for legitimate users. Right? You just overload it. So this happens. So you know this. There are certain promotional periods, some seasons, right? There are a lot of traffic in some of these institutions or the platforms because you have discount schemes and there all those things. Then a lot of people will turn up. A lot of demand. So this denial of services attack we experienced during QR code implementation as well, if you can remember. Initially, what happens? People started complaining that the system is not accessible, right? So it couldn't handle the volume. So due to that, even the legitimate user cannot. So there are attackers, hackers, right? They do this. They just increase the traffic of the systems. And when you increase the traffic of the system, at a point the system cannot accommodate all the users. And it will even deny a genuine user entering the system. Sometimes you see this, there are certain people who enjoy doing this. If you must have experience even on social media, on WhatsApp and Facebook and various social media channels, there are certain posts they share and they just want it to go viral, right? You must have seen some promotional, right? They say this organization is giving away a vehicle. You just have to forward this to 50 people or something like that. So people just keep on forwarding it. What they do is they just create the traffic in the platform, right? So same thing can happen. So they can just keep bugging a system, right? Increase the traffic, and then the system will deny the genuine user entering the system. That's the idea. That's the meaning of denial of services attack. I hope it's clear. Right. How do you assess? What are the different methods you use to assess? So the basic or the most common way is what we call impact and likelihood assessment, because that's how we define risk as well. Impact into likelihood is the risk. So how do you do that? You get the impact. Impact is in terms of monetary value. So you estimate if this risk materializes, how much is the loss? You have an amount. Let's say you determine if this risk materializes, the loss is 100,000. Then you decide how likely it will happen, the probability. So let's say you have an assessment, okay, there's a 75% chance, right? 75% chance it will happen. Then your risk score is 100,000 into 75%. That is 75,000. So that is how you get the risk score. But I will come back to this slide after I show you this, right? Here is an example, right? You can have, this is called the heat map. You can, depending on certain calculations, you can identify different levels, right? You can have a score. So the likelihood, you can have 1, 2, 3, 4, how likely, that is probability based on your probabilities, maybe up to 25%, 25 to 50%, 50 to 75%, 75 to 100%, right? The chances of occurrence you can identify, and then you have a grid there. The impact score, impact can be based on the financial value up to 100,000, 100,000 to 1 million, 1 million to 50 million, 50 million plus. Likewise, you can have cutoffs. Now, all these are estimates based on what the organization wants, right? There is no hard and fast rule, there is no universally accepted cutoffs here. It's just a method or methodology. Now, you can see the risk score. You can have a risk score based on the multiplication, right? So the total level. So 1 into 1 is 1, 2 into 2 is 4, 2 into 3 is 6, right? That side. But look at the color coding. Right? Color coding, you have the risk levels. R1 is 1 level, right? Because based on the score you get, based on the grid you have, you can define, say for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Likelihood 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 1 could be very low, 2 could be low, 3 could be medium, 4 could be high probability, right? Same way, impact, you can have a value as I told you, under up to 1,000, you can say 1, 1,000 to 10,000, 2. Likewise, you can have cutoffs. So this, as I told you, it's highly adjustable. So each organization can decide how you score. There's no hard and fast rule to say 1 should be below 100,000, 2 should be 100 to 200. That's entirely in the hands of the organization, right? Then we calculate the risk score. That's how we get the heat map, because this risk score, once you calculate, will give you a number value. So based on the overall thing, you can have a range. What are the different risks? Now, this, according to this, you have different levels of. So there are 4 types of risks, right? You can see 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 risk types. What is the most severe risk here out of the given risk? What is the most severe one? Or the greatest risk or highest risk? What is that?
R2.
R2. R2. Some say R4. Okay, any other thoughts? Some say R2, some say R4. So when you have a color coding, that color coding implies the different levels of risk. Green, yellow, amber, red, right? So green could be low risk, yellow could be very low risk, yellow could be low risk, amber could be medium, red could be high, whatever, right? Now see, this is a product, as I told you, of impact and likelihood, right? There's a score we get. Then for the score, we have a color code. If you go by that, both R2 and R4 are at the same level, right? Because it's a product, right? The total risk figure that you get at. According to this, both R2 and R4 are in red zone. That means there is a definition for the red zone, high risk probably. Both are high risk. The next one is R3. Yeah, the risk of R3 is lower than R2 and R4. And risk of R1 is even lower than that. So this will help you when you identify different risks and do this exercise and map your risk in each cage depending on where it fits into. You will identify the relative standing of all these factors. What are high risk items, what are low risk items, all that can be understood. That's the idea of this analysis. Right, so then we have scenario analysis, right? Scenario analysis. What is scenario analysis? Scenario analysis is, it also is called top-down method. That means you identify different scenarios, right? Under each scenario, what could be the possible outcome? So it could be best case, worst case, most likely case kind of a scenario, or probably even beyond that, depends on how you want the stages. Then we have something called the bottom-up approach. That is, now the scenario, you first decide the scenario and then go down to suit that. Bottom-up is you start from the low end, right? You identify individual risks and then see how these risk is going up in the ladder. So because whether there are other risks that are similar to this one, you pull them. Likewise, you keep on adding the risk up to the organization from the bottom to upper level.
Can you please explain that map again?
Sorry?
That map, heat map, risk map.
Yeah.
Yes. I didn't follow that actually. The R2 and R3.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So it's like this. When you do this exercise, you identify, this is all predetermined, right? This is all predetermined. You have to first define it. You need to first define likelihood. Let's say we'll identify different risks. Okay, risk. Let's say one risk is counter, right? The counter cashier giving more money to the customer when they withdraw. Let's say Then likelihood score, depending on the people who are there in the counter, depending on their experience, depending on your past track record, you may assume 1, 2, 3, 4 on the likelihood side, right? The likelihood score is on this side. Let me use the going right. This side, likelihood. So 1 means highly unlikely or very low, right? This is low, this is medium, this is high, right? Highly likely, right? Now you make an assessment that depending on the situation, it's low, right? Likelihood is low. So from the likelihood side, you are here. Not sorry, you're here, right? We haven't come this page yet. You are here. And then you identify the impact, that is the financial loss, if in case it materializes. Okay, you assume you should look at a situation where the cashier people giving more money to the customer than what they require. Then what could be the loss if that happens? So the maximum that can happen is the person can give all the money the person has. That's the extreme case. But that is highly unlikely. People will just give everything, right? But depending on the average transaction volume, you can decide, okay, generally, if at all, even if the person is giving more money to the counter, the customer, when they demand, the possibility is maximum 100,000. It can't be beyond that. So you get an estimate. So if that is 100,000, you have predetermined values here. So you say this is 1 to 10,000 losses here, 10,000 to 100,000 is here, 100,000 to 500,000 is here, or 500,000 is here, right? That's how you define the impact score. So you are talking about 100,000, so you are here. Now I identified the likelihood score, I identified the impact score. So based on these two, my risk, I am going to park here, let's say risk Rx. This is where my risk is parked. And you also have a third level of definition in your matrix. Depending on the total risk score, you can have a color code. Let's say your value up to the maximum here is 10,000, right? 10,000 into, let's say this is 2 is 20,000, 3 is 30,000, right? 30,000. Up to 30,000 risk score, right? We consider as green. You just decide it, right? There is no hard and fast rules. Or you identify the grid. This I have given only 4, right? You can have 5 cages here. 5 this way and 5 this way. Or you can have 6. You can even have 10. Right? It depends on how you want to monitor. There's no hard and fast rule how big the grid should be. Then you identify based on these risk scores. This is our green zone, right? I can have this or whatever the level. And this is our yellow zone, right? And this is our amber zone. This is our red zone. So each of these color code represent your risk level. So don't go by this R1, R2, R3. R1, R2, R3 are different risk incidents, right? These are examples we are going and parking. So according to this, green is the lowest risk, yellow is the next level of risk, then amber is the next level of risk, red is the highest risk in the organization. So when you want to bucket, we need to put these risks into different buckets. You put both R2 and R4 in the same bucket because in your grid, both of them are red zone. Right? R3 in one bucket, R1 in another bucket. So that's how you park these risks. Am I clear now?
So excuse me.
Thanks for the explanation.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, regarding if you compare the R2 and R4, out of these two, can't we take R2 is more higher? Don't you like? Because at 4 into 3 is 12.
No,
there, 2 into 2 is
don't go
16.
by 4 into 3, 4 into 4 kind of thing, right? These are just,
Okay.
this 4 is not a value here.
Right.
4 is a label.
Okay. If it comes in the question paper, we have to answer R2 and R4 both, right? Not only R2, R2.
Yeah, if
Something like
it
this.
comes in a question paper, you go by the shading.
Okay, understand.
You have a shading, no, there is a shading that defines the region, red zone.
Yeah, understand.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So the lowest risk is yellow color.
your lowest is green.
Green.
Yeah,
As per the
Green.
R1 classification,
R1 is in the second level. R1 is the risk. This is an example. Let's say I told you cashiers giving more money.
yes.
That is an example. You term it as R1, right? Key employee is leaving the organization. R2, right? Cyber attack, R4. I mean, these are just labels, different risks. Risk 1, risk 2, risk 3, risk 4.
Okay.
These are 4 different risks. They have parked in 4 different areas.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. Shall I move now? So then I discuss about scenario. I discuss about the bottom up as well. And remember earlier I discussed, this is also part of this KRI, key risk indicator story, right? That's the 4th one. Technically, this key risk indicator should also come here after this, right? So key risk indicator, I told you what are key risk indicators. That means you identify different parameters. In this case, they are talking about turnover. Labor turnover is the example they have taken in this case, right? So you can identify, probably we don't take the total turnover as a risk because any employee leaving the organization will not have a risk to the level when a key employee is leaving, right? You need to identify most of the organization. We look at this as a high performer leaving the organization, high performers leaving, or critical people leaving the organization. To identify those key people. So if you don't have that kind of a precise definition, you can even go by the overall labor turnover, right? People leaving the organization. So this graph shows you identify key people leaving the organization as a risk factor, right? The turnover of them. Then you define the limit, amber limit, red limit. That means amber limit is the limit that alerts you, you must start acting on it. That means, let's say you have identified the labor turnover as the parameter, and the red level is when the labor turnover hits 15%. That means 15% is the maximum you can tolerate. Beyond that, it's a risk. Now, amber limit you can set at, let's say, 10%. Your starting labor turnover is 6%, let's say, for argument's sake. And then you set the amber limit as 10, red limit as 50. Which means when the turnover hits the amber limit, that gives you a signal that you must activate your plans, mitigation measures. Before it hits the red zone, we must now act. So that's the idea of amber limit. It is not only for labor turnover, you can use it for any other criteria, any other parameter. You use this key risk indicator criteria, right? Is that clear? Right. Key risk of key staff loss. Now I'm giving you further examples here. Okay. So how this exercise is done. You can use various other risk indicators, right? Depending on how you look at. So that can include even, let's say, system outages, right? So you have a tolerance, how many outages you can tolerate. So beyond a particular limit, it's a danger zone. And then you can talk about certain, let's say, investment situations, you can have limits. And then you can have certain labor related ones are people. Then you can have system related ones. And then you can have even natural disasters instances, right? So number of, let's say, based on the pandemic, we noted that we have lockdowns, we had to close the branches, right? So you can have a cutoff, okay, we can close them for 2 days, that is okay, but the 3 days is a red zone, it's an amber zone. Then 5 days would be your red zone, because if the more you close, the more you lose. But this KRI measure, you have both pluses and minuses. So I will explain you, because these are exam related areas, right? Advantages, one thing is that you clearly identify trends in the movements of those parameters. Therefore, you can identify the problems in advance, because when you look at the parameters, it moves in a particular direction, then it gives you a signal whether it's going in the right direction or not, so that you can foresee a problem. Secondly, you have the freedom, whoever is monitoring it, to determine, right, and establish the limits. Without waiting till the red zone, you can set earlier limits, right? So at those levels, you can start activating your actions. And then it is an objective way of risk measurement, because there's no gut feeling. You have a clearly defined criteria and measurement. You just go by the number, factual evidence. But here are the disadvantages. It's very important. I tell you one example. It can have skewed business performance. Now, it's very interesting. What this says is, let's say in the organization, you define your key risk indicator like the previous one. What is the indicator? Key staff leaving the organization. So then you have identified who the key staff are. So key staff could be some specialized staff who work on certain processes, or certain high performers in the organization. Those are the key staff probably. Now, when you define a KRI taking the key staff, and when you say the turnover going up is a risky deal, then the management or the managers responsible for those processes, they will do their best to save or protect the key staff in the organization, because that is a defined matrix in risk management, and if they don't manage it, their performance will be affected. Therefore, they will focus on that KPI. The problem with that is when they keep their eye on the key staff, because that is connected to their bonuses or the performance, they might lose focus on other staff. So your key staff will stay and other staff will leave the organization, and you are inviting another problem in another area. So that's why it says it can have skewed business performance, because the managers will focus on the KRIs and they manage their work to achieve KRIs and forget the rest of the areas. And the same thing is true when you have a KPI based performance management system, because most of the organizations go for this KPI based PMS. One way it is a good thing, but the downside is if your KPIs are not comprehensive enough to cover a 360 degree of the employee's job description, you are indirectly pushing the employee to only work on KPIs and forget about the rest, because they know there is no implication on their performance or bonus on other areas. They'll be measured on KPIs only. So if you are working in the risk department, you have the freedom to go and challenge your HR department or the management if organization is trying to implement a KPI system with limited number of KPIs. So sometimes what happens is when you define these KPIs, so you say you don't, these experts say don't have 50, 60 KPIs, have 10 KPIs for one individual, something like that. But if that 10 KPIs do not cover the 360 degree of the JD of the person, there's a possibility that the person will not perform certain tasks and there's no implication on his performance, because you can't penalize the person. There's no KPI for that, right? Then we have historical loss data, right? Historical loss data. So how do you get historical loss data? Here what happens is you collect the losses taken place previously in the past periods and you categorize them. And then you use them to draw a graph. So as you can see in the next slide, it's called the loss distribution. That loss distribution. So this captures all the historical losses and their frequencies, right? The value of the loss and number of occurrences. So as you can see, that this curve is generally skewed, right? Because it's not a normal distribution, equally distributed. So in any organization, there's a higher chance of having higher number of low value losses, right? Now, there's an interesting thing here. You can see this, the middle part, there's expected losses, there's unexpected losses. Tell me which part is the risk. Do you consider this as risk or this as risk or both as risk or none of them as risk? What is your choice? I'm going to give you something. Hold on. First answer is A. Second answer is B. Third answer is A and B. Fourth is none of them, right? So A, B, C, D. So I'm going to run a poll. right? I'm going to run a poll. Give me your answer. Okay. I'm asking which one is a risk? So I have 30 participants. 11 people have responded. Seventeen. Right. So 17 people have responded. This is your answer. 24% says A, 47% says B, 29% says Z. So it's very important to understand the logic here again, right? So this grid shows the losses in value terms, how it distributes. Expected losses. If you expect the loss, that means you're prepared for this or not prepared for it. If you expect a loss, are you preparing for it or not?
You're preparing for
Yeah.
it.
How you prepare? How you prepare?
By taking mitigation measures.
Expected losses. If you expect the losses will take place, what do you do?
Keep a provision.
Provision,
For
yes.
You provide for it, right? The impairments, we use the expected loss model. For expected losses, you provide. Is it risk? Is it considered as risk? If you expect a loss, it is not risk. You expect, you provide. It might not get materialized. That's a different story, right? So the provision, impairment provision is not loss provision, not risk provision. Huh? That is provide for expected losses. What is the risk? Risk is unexpected losses. Is provisioning a mitigation measure? Tell me. Is provisioning, if you provide for a loss, is it a mitigation measure?
No.
Yes or no?
No.
No. Why? What is mitigation?
Mitigating is we are trying to minimize it from happening.
There are two things. Risk has two elements. You have the likelihood, you have the impact, the financial amount or the probability. So if it is mitigation, either the financial amount should come down or the likelihood should come down, right? With the insurance, which part we are tracking? Is it the likelihood or impact? If you take an insurance,
Impact.
impact, right? By taking an insurance, you can't prevent an accident happening, right? By taking an insurance, you are minimizing the loss, financial impact to the organization. So you will not take the hit. It will be taken by someone else, so that you are reducing the hit to you, right? So if you provide, you are taking the hit. There's no mitigation. Got it? Therefore, don't consider the provision as a mitigation measure. So the expected losses are not risks. You will provide for it. That means you embrace that risk. You deal with it. Right? You take that loss. No mitigation. Unexpected losses.
Car insurance as well.
You have risk. That means that's what you need to plan, right? What could go wrong? There could be possible issues. So you prepare in advance. You identify the risk. Then you plan for mitigation, preventive controls, detective controls, mitigation measures. You look for all those things. Right. So understand this practically, right? Because otherwise, if you just go by the theory, you will not get the concepts right. That's why I'm reminding you some of them again and again when I'm doing it. You need to engage so that you polish your knowledge. Right, it's 8:40 now. Shall we take a 15-minute break? Yeah. 8:55. So I think those cricket fans didn't miss the last over. I gave the break at the last minute. Right. Let's start the session now. We talk about the operational risk framework and the components we discussed about. And we also have practical constraints or issues in effectively implementing an operational management framework. So what are those? First one is data collection constraints. Because if you look at the operational risks we discussed, there are 4 key areas, right? It's people, processes, systems, and external events. And it can happen anywhere in the organization. Therefore, you have to have a robust mechanism to collect data from all the points and making sure that you don't miss out on anything. It is not easy because these data feeders are not possible to be created to cover all instances. And also, when we assess risk, especially when you identify risk, you know what the risk is, but when you assess it, you need to be able to quantify that risk. And for that to happen, sometimes you need industry data, market data to benchmark, to gauge the risk. So that is also a problem for most of the organization, lack of that data in the organization or outside the organization hinders your ability to accurately measure the risk. The next issue is the cultural constraints. Because sometimes the business heads, especially I think some of you might find this point very familiar in your organization. When you try to mitigate or manage operational risk, or when you try to collect risk data, some of the business people consider it as a kind of a red tape. It destructs the business. As a result, the business managers, when they do not believe in the value of managing operational risk, will not support to effectively carry out this. They sometimes do not even report the risk. They don't capture risk. So when they don't support in the process, it is difficult to get the real picture. And then it's important to have that cultural acceptance of the risk or the managing of risk. Then resourcing and cost constraints no need to elaborate on it, right? So when you implement this, you have to have a lot of equipments, human capital, and various other resources. Some organizations cannot afford this. And the indicator constraints, right? And if you go by the KRI method, key risk indicator method, right? There you should be able to define indicators to cover all possible areas. I told you earlier, if you don't capture all the areas precisely in the KRI system, if you have, there's a possibility for the staff or the management to go towards one side. They might ignore certain aspects. Right. So these are some of the key areas. And then we are going into another topic called a risk register. Now, the problem with this one is there's no clearly defined set of things that you need to have in a risk register. It's just that the organization use this as a tool to capture the risk, right? You capture the risk and different aspects of those risks. Now, in this book, they have identified, based on what is mostly practiced, what are the common things that you generally have in a register. Now, when you look at this, sometimes you might not be able to relate these steps or these components for all types of risk. So depending on the type of risk, some of these things have to be adjusted. So you may have to pick and choose which aspect is covered, which aspect is used to capture that risk. And also, when we assess this risk, as I told you earlier, there is always a possibility to ignore or have some oversights on certain risk elements. So you have to have some criteria to make sure that when you capture this risk, all possible aspects of the risk is captured so that then you can make an assessment, the realistic assessment of the risk. So what do you have in a risk register when you identify? When there's a risk, if you go back to our initial definition of risk, I told it is about an incident or an event or occurrence that will affect an objective of an organization, the process, product, and eventually it will have a financial implication. So when you identify a risk, when you identify something as a risk, you should be able to identify what are the objectives that are going to be affected. What are the processes being affected? What are the products being affected by this risk? And then a brief description about the risk, but it is, some explanation for a reader to understand what it is. And the ranking, remember we discussed about the different levels of risk, right? Different zones, we make an assessment, you identify those, and then you have to rank. You can have 10 different types of risks. Then where do you park this among the rest of the risk? It's about the priority based on severity, right? The severity of the risk is the basis for the priority. Then who is the lead person or the department responsible for this risk, right? Under whose purview you need to handle this. Action plan. How are we going to address this risk, right? When are we going to complete this action plan? And what are we going to achieve at the end of the action plan as a target? Right? Then sources, who or which party is going to validate it, review it, and support. Then the mitigating controls. You can see this is not sometimes a comprehensive list of things. This is what is found in your book, but they also started saying, right? You can see the note, they also start saying that this is not the list, right? There's no universally accepted list, but it captures whatever the logical relevant areas. Then when you identify the risk and assess the risk, you need to then manage it. What are the methods of managing operational risk exposure? Not only for operational risk, this is common for any risk. There are 4 broad areas. First one is transferring the risk. Transferring the risk. Now, transferring means you're parking the risk in someone else's courts so that you don't have to face it. Either you outsource it or you insure it. In both cases, you won't take the full pain of the matter. It's somebody will take care of it. You pay that party a certain amount for taking that, but it is relieved from your account. Then avoiding risk. That is the most convenient and safest option to manage this. That is avoid. How do you avoid risk? You do not sell that product. If you don't sell that product, you don't have a risk from that product because there's no value or market in it. Right? So avoiding is another. Sometimes in the current context, right, this turbulent economic environment that we are going through, some organizations may want to take this path as well, right? In your organization, you have different business segments, different products. Then if you look at the level of risk that you are exposed to, given the risk levels, right? Nature of the business, nature of the product. Sometimes certain organizations might decide, let us quit from that area for a while, right? Withdraw. Don't do that for a while because that is a measure you are taking to mitigate the risk. Then mitigating through controls. So I told you when you look at controls, there are two broader types of controls. So the two types are preventive controls and detective controls. So the preventive controls are those prevent the risk materializing. They will not allow the risk to materialize. Right? So one example is if there is a possibility of staff entering incorrect data to the system. So you can have a preventive control, some data validation rules you can introduce. Say, for example, you must have seen, right, when you enter the details, there's a space to enter the identity card. So identity card has certain number of digits. It can have only numbers and one letter at the end, right? So if somebody is trying to enter letters or someone is trying to enter smaller number of digits than what the standard number should be, so you identify those letters and you locate. There's a validation. So this validation will make sure that wrong information is not fed to the system. At the entering point, you are preventing that mistake happening. Right? That is preventive controls. Or sometimes a make a check. When one person is making, another person is checking or reviewing, that again is a preventive control. So you're trying to have more eyes at the beginning so that you can prevent it. The detective controls are, as I mentioned earlier, they are to alert. If something goes wrong, they alert you, right? But that alert comes after, right? It's kind of a you sometimes use this type of controls post-mortem, right? Once the damage is done, you go and identify. So that because it tells you the damage has taken place, then you go and address it. Those are the detective controls. Then another interesting thing, right, accepting risk, right? So the fourth one is accepting. You either transfer risk, avoid risk, mitigate risk, or accept, right? So the topic is methods of managing risk, not mitigating, right? Methods of managing. You can manage in all these four ways. Either you transfer the risk, you avoid the risk, or you mitigate. That means you reduce the overall risk value or exposure, or you embrace the risk, accept the risk as it is. So you are ready to face the repercussions. Then under mitigation, right? Under mitigation, that is reduce the risk. You have preventive and detective controls. I explained you earlier. There's another interesting and important area that is called the BCP, Business Continuity Planning and Disaster Recovery. Right. Now, if you look at BCP and disaster recovery, DR is more towards IT related. That's what we look at. But BCP is all over. It covers everything. So in simple terms, what is business continuity planning? Can I know any comments from you all? How do you define business continuity planning? What is your thinking or understanding? I don't need a technical or theoretical definition to business continuity planning. I would like to understand what you feel or what you know about it, how you understand that concept.
A mechanism to ensure an organization meets resilience in the event of an unforeseen event.
Okay, thank you. Any other?
If an unplanned incident happens disturbing the continuity of the work, we just to have a plan as to what we can do to bring it back, like or to continue our work or continue with the minimum disturbance.
How to plan if an unplanned thing happens?
It is a contingency plan.
Sorry?
When any disaster is happening, prior to disaster is happening, there is some sort of a plan for prepare for to face that disaster.
That is DR, disaster recovery. Yeah. BCP, business continuity planning. So if you look at the term continuity, that's the key word here. Business continuity. That means irrespective of the disruption, you should be able to continue business as usual. There could be a disruption, but you will continue. Say, for example, now I have a BCP issue, right? I have a risk, that is, there can be a power cut, right? All of a sudden, there can be a power cut when I'm continuing the lecture. So if I have a BCP, irrespective of the power cut, I should be able to continue my lecture. That is called BCP, right? If you have arrangements, if you have thought of those possible events, if you have foreseen those incidents and events, and if you have prepared based on that, right? You have backup arrangements, you have other alternative measures. As a result, even the power cut takes place, I will continue. So I have an arrangement at my home. I have fixed a off-grid solar system. So I don't know when the power cut takes place. So when there is power in the grid, I use it. When the power cut happens, the off-grid system works. So I have a BCP arrangement at my home. Same way, you can have organizations. You look at, for example, a risk could be all of a sudden a certain staff member leaving the organization, right? Maybe a key person working on a particular area. So even if the person is leaving the organization, you should be able to continue the work. That is BCP. So BCP, if you want to have proper BCP, first you need to foresee possible disruptions. What can go wrong? What are the possible disruptions that might affect us? Identify those instances. And then you identify mitigating measures or backup arrangement. If this happens, this is how we're going to handle it. If this happens, this is how we're going to handle it. It's like what? So that is BCP. And even we talk about BCP sites, right? All the banks, they have a BCP site. That means a separate branch or a location with the computers and other facilities. In the event of a disruption to your main office, wherever the people work in their current places, if there's a disruption there, you are geared to carry out your work from another place. So that although your office is affected, your work is not affected. Your customers are not affected. It will continue as usual. But the problem is we must be realistic in our assessment to see, do we really have a BCP site? Sometimes we talk about a BCP site. That is not a BCP site. Most of us have a sample testing site, not a BCP site. We have all the applications installed in the computers. When the BCP drills are done, some people from the office representing different departments will go to that site, run the applications to see whether they work, and come back and say BCP test done. But if you get a real attack on your main building, you try and see whether you can go and work there, you can't. So that's a problem we have. We don't have actual BCP arrangements in our organization if you really look at it that sense. We have just sample points, right? That's for your information I mentioned, but the BCP is about ensuring continuity. Disaster recovery is that when a disaster takes place, I told you when the disaster takes place, there'll be a shock anyway, right? There'll be a shock to the organization. There'll be an effect. Disaster recovery means how fast you recover, your operational areas. That means back to normal. What is the arrangement for you to get the organization back on track? In the meantime, the BCP will continue, right? So that is how. So disaster recovery is mostly connected to the IT sites, IT related things. That's where we talk about the backup arrangements and all, to making sure if you have an attack on your main site and the data is lost, you quickly take the backup and activate it. So there'll be a slight loss or a gap in between, depending on how fast the organization is acting. Then we have, right, we talk about BCP and disaster recovery. And also remember this BCP, you need to have BCP for BCP as well. What is that? Sometimes when you say BCP, there is a team of people who will act as the team who is looking after things. So imagine a worst case. Let's say you have a building, all your staff, is most of the banks, we have this concept called the head office, corporate office. The entire top management in the bank is living in that building. Imagine that building collapsed. That means the entire building is affected due to natural disaster, or man-made disaster, or terrorist attack, or whatever. Then what happens? Your CEO, CFO, DGMs, all gone. So what happens? So we need to have in our BCP, we have to clearly identify, in the event of a physical damage to our head office, what is the arrangement in the organization to run the show? You need to have in your BCP a separate identified team. If this layer is not available, X or Y would be the leader. This person will take over the matter, because there has to be decision-making authority after that. There has to be a team outside that to work on it. So if you don't have that kind of arrangement, it is like sometimes when you go and ask, where is the backup? He says, I take a backup to my pen drive and I put the pen drive in the drawer and go home. When there's a fire, both the computer and the backup both will go. So that is the kind of BCP we have sometimes, right? So don't look at that way. So you need to be prepared. Imagine a situation and see how are we going to operate? How are we going to run? Therefore, technically, when you have BCP, you can't have one team running the show. You need to have separate divisions, separate components of BCP. You have a BCP and you have to have a BCP for BCP team as well, right? And if the finance function is disabled, there has to be a mechanism to operate the finance function from elsewhere, right? So how I will do that? So you need to have arrangements for that. Then we have outsourcing, right? Outsourcing is also an arrangement, mitigation we discussed earlier as well. So you hand over certain part of your operational task to another party so that you transfer your risk from your organization to another party. Then we have the insurance we discussed, right? That is also a mitigation measure, right? Then we need to talk about an important part, the information and cybersecurity aspect, right? So that is also an important area to look at because in current context, in today's context, information and cybersecurity is considered one of the biggest risks faced by the financial institutions, because it's highly sensitive, under threat. Because today, information is considered one of the most valuable information. For certain organization, it is the most valuable information because most of the decisions are taken based on information. Most on the deals are done. Most of the activities when the organizations grow done through information. So information is key because that is the main feeder for decision. So we consider this as a huge risk. Therefore, in your textbook, there are additional considerations to mitigate or monitor these kind of risks. Right. Secure IT systems. So that is where sometimes most of the organizations, they disable some of the functionalities. Right? Network security. Take measures to protect network security, because here most of the organizations, they disable connecting untrusted people, untrusted units, devices to the network. And also you safeguard your main network, your home banking system and main network. And if anyone wants to access certain other, if you want to go to internet or wherever, then you have separate channels without disrupting your main network. So you need to safeguard your network, both in terms of data integrity, making sure that no garbage is in, and the traffic, right? You should not allow the network to be trafficked or blocked, so maintain that space. Then we have penetration testing. Penetration testing, what is that? What is that? Penetration testing. We also call it vulnerability tests. What is that? Does anyone know that? Does anyone know that?
Whether an outside party could penetrate the system?
So what? How do you do the testing?
Mm.
And this is also called ethical hacking. Have you heard of this term, ethical hacking? That means you don't come as anonymous and hack it, right? You let the people hack. Some organizations get experts, hackers, right? Youngsters, IT enthusiasts. They challenge openly, come and hack our system, right? So this is what we call penetration testing. So you let the experts to come and try to hack your system and see whether it's loose, whether there are loose ends that allows others to hack you. That is also called vulnerability tests. So it's an area that most of the banks need to pay attention to, but unfortunately in Sri Lanka, we don't have enough experts. We have around 2 players in the market, as I know, who can do that, right? But whether they are strong enough, given the global exposure we have, it's a question mark. But the point here is that your developer can guarantee the safety of your systems as of today, because it can say all the existing viruses and various other possible attacks we have identified and we have safeguarded the system. But hackers are also evolving, viruses are evolving. Therefore, what is not working for today, tomorrow they can find a different way to hack the system. Therefore, you have to have continuous upgrade. Remember, the danger there is that most of the financial institutions are entirely run on the IT platforms. Imagine that you get an attack on your main platform. That's the end of the bank, right? So these are very high risk factors. Then managing user privileges, very important, right? Sometimes we see even the auditors pick on those things, right? Employees leave the organizations, but their access levels are still there. So they can go and do various things to your system because they still have the access. And when the employees transfer from one department to the other, they may not need the access they had previously because they might get into a different department with different tasks. If you keep the access open for that person, there is a possibility that the person can compromise data. So therefore, it's very important to frequently evaluate the privileges or user access and manage it. And the user education and awareness, how they need to be educated, how to deal with the IT things, how to manage certain applications. Incident management means how fast you manage your incident. Whenever there's an incident, do we have the expertise and resources to deal with it? Then malware prevention, that's where you get the firewalls and all these safety measures, right? Virus guards. Monitoring, that is especially the network traffic and various other parameters of your system need to be monitored frequently to see any unusual behaviors or hints. Then the removable media controls, most of the organization, when they give laptops or even desktops, they disable the pen drives and various other devices being connected. And in the current context, this is another important area, home and mobile working, because now after this pandemic, we have started the trend of working from home. So when you work from home, how you safeguard your information security and the secrecy of data. So that's an area to look at. Right. Then the physical security is not very difficult. So you need to be sure of the people, do some tests, validation test, background check to understand the people's previous records. Then to avoid unauthorized people accessing the areas, having visible ID cards. Now this is another interesting and funny thing. See, this is happening in your organizations as well. Why do we have an ID card? That is to prove your identity, right? So, but for most of the people, it's like a cosmetic. It's like a jewelry. They wear the thing around the neck and put the ID in the pocket and then they walk, right? So when you come through the security gate, it should be visible. The security guard should be able to cross-check your face and the ID card. Or if you have access controls, you should be able to punch your access. So you need to have those practices. Then sign in for all visitors, right? When visitors come, how you track them. And you have to be careful of all the external threats. You know, in the past, we have experienced people disguise themselves. They wear helmets and various other, parts to hide their identity, and they come and have issues. So we need to have measures to cover all of them. Right, risk awareness training, I told you. Right. So when we have operational loss data, one is we need to escalate. I told you earlier, escalation metrics, you need to remote it to different layers. So the threshold means we clearly indicate who to report, when to report, what to report, depending on the risk level, value, and the severity. So that has to be clearly established so that whenever there's a risk level, risk incident, the people are aware who to report, what to report, and there are clear guidance. And then also, it's important to analyze the cause. Cause analysis I explained earlier. The origination of the risk. What was the reason? Why it triggered? Because when you predict the risk, what is important is not the risk, but the originator. What causes the risk? Right? Last year we had 25 errors in particular area could be your risk. But why that 25 errors took place, if you identify, probably it was a manual process. Now we have automated the process. That means you cannot predict, you cannot look at that risk to be repeated in future because the root cause has been addressed now. That's why it is important to have the causal analysis. Then you know what are the causes of risk, and then in future you know how to manage it by looking at how to address the causes. Right. Any questions, clarifications on the topic we discussed today? Further questions? Right. If you don't have any further questions, that's it for today. We'll see you next week with a new topic. Good night and have a nice weekend.
Good night.
Good night, sir. Thank you.